When Valerian rose to prominence in the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was already in a state of near perpetual crisis. The death of Decius in 251 had left a power vacuum, and his successors, Trebonianus Gallus and Aemilian, had struggled to impose order on an empire increasingly plagued by foreign invasions, internal usurpations, economic strain, and religious unrest. It was in this climate that Publius Licinius Valerianus, known to history simply as Valerian, emerged as both a soldier and politician who seemed to embody the qualities of discipline, stability, and respect for tradition that the Roman Senate and people so desperately longed for. Yet despite the hopes that surrounded his ascent, Valerian's reign would come to symbolize the fragility of imperial power during the 3rd century crisis, and his tragic fate would mark him as one of Rome's most unfortunate emperors. Valerian had a long and distinguished career before he even ascended to the purple. Born around the year 200 CE into a senatorial family of some standing, he grew up in an environment steeped in Roman tradition and elite values. Unlike many emperors of his time, who rose rapidly from the military ranks through charisma or force, Valerian was thoroughly entrenched in the aristocratic order of Rome. He held a number of prestigious offices, including consul, and was known for his administrative skills as much as his loyalty to the state. His career brought him into close contact with the Senate, which regarded him with respect. This senatorial connection would later play a key role in his legitimacy as emperor, since many of his contemporaries had little or no support among Rome's traditional governing elite. When Decius died in 251 and Gallus took the throne, Valerian was entrusted with important commands, including responsibility for the defense of the Rhine frontier. This was a significant post, since the Rhine frontier was one of the most dangerous edges of the empire, constantly threatened by incursions of Germanic tribes. Valerian's assignment to this position reflected the confidence placed in him as a capable commander. However, the situation worsened rapidly. In 253, Aemilian, the governor of Mysia, was proclaimed emperor by his troops after a victory against the Goths. He marched against Gallus, who called on Valerian for aid. Before Valerian could arrive with reinforcements, Gallus was killed by his own soldiers, and Aemilian temporarily held the throne. But Aemilian's reign was short-lived, as Valerian's army declared him emperor, and Aemilian himself was killed by his troops before the two sides could clash. In this way, Valerian ascended to power in the summer of 253, acclaimed by both his soldiers and recognized by the Senate, something rare for emperors of this period. Valerian immediately confronted the challenge of ruling an empire stretched to its breaking point. The 3rd century crisis was in full swing. On nearly every frontier, Rome faced threats. In the north, Germanic tribes pressed across the Rhine and Danube, launching devastating raids into Roman territory. In the east, the powerful Sassanian Persian Empire under Shapur I was emerging as a new and formidable rival, capable of threatening Rome's eastern provinces with devastating invasions. Inside the empire, revolts and usurpations were constant. To add to these difficulties, plague and economic collapse undermined the prosperity and stability of Roman society. The empire was at war with itself and its neighbors, while its population faced disease, depopulation, and declining trade. Valerian realized that the problems of the empire were too great for a single man to handle. He decided to share imperial power with his son, Publius Licinius Ignatius Gallienus, whom he elevated to co-emperor in 253. This division of responsibilities was both practical and symbolic. It gave Rome two emperors to confront crises on multiple fronts simultaneously, while also laying the groundwork for dynastic continuity. Valerian would focus his efforts in the east against the Persians, while Gallienus would defend the western frontiers in Italy. In theory, this arrangement allowed Rome to meet threats more effectively, but in practice, it exposed the empire's fragmentation and the difficulty of coordinating responses across vast distances. The early years of Valerian's reign were consumed by the Persian threat. Shapur I had already shown his ambitions by invading Mesopotamia and Syria during the reign of Gordian III, and later pressing against Roman holdings in Armenia. By the time Valerian came to power, Shapur had consolidated his position, and the Persian Empire was enjoying a period of military strength and expansion. Valerian's first task was to assemble an army large enough to confront Shapur and restore Roman authority in the east. He marched with considerable forces, and for a time, he was successful. Around 255, Valerian recaptured Antioch, one of the great cities of the east, which had fallen to the Persians. He also attempted to stabilize Roman control over Syria and Asia Minor, though these campaigns were costly and difficult. While Valerian labored in the east, Gallienus faced immense difficulties in the west. Germanic tribes poured across the Danube and Rhine, devastating the provinces of Pannonia, Mysia, and Gaul. The Alemanni invaded Italy itself, threatening the very heart of the empire. Gallienus proved himself an able commander, defeating the Alemanni near Milan around 259. However, the western provinces were increasingly slipping into disorder, and rival generals began to assert independence, foreshadowing the rise of the so-called Gallic Empire. Valerian's decision to divide responsibilities had practical benefits, but it also highlighted the reality that the empire was no longer a unified whole, but rather a collection of regions that could easily fragment under local military strongmen. Valerian's reign was also marked by one of the harshest persecutions of Christians up to that point. Following the example of Decius, he issued edicts demanding that Christians participate in sacrifices to the Roman gods and the well-being of the emperor. Those who refused were subject to exile, confiscation of property, or execution. Among the victims were prominent Christian leaders such as Pope Sixtus II and the deacon Lawrence, whose martyrdoms became celebrated in Christian tradition. Valerian's persecution reflected not only hostility to the growing Christian movement, but also a desperate attempt to restore unity through traditional religion. To emperors like Valerian, the refusal of Christians to honor the Roman gods threatened the favor of the divine powers on which the empire depended. In a time of crisis, their nonconformity was seen as dangerous and subversive. The strain of constant warfare took its toll on Valerian's armies. The plague that had ravaged the empire since the time of Decius reappeared, devastating Roman troops as they attempted to campaign in the east. Cities were depopulated, agricultural production collapsed, and the empire's manpower dwindled. Valerian's resources were stretched thin, and while he achieved some temporary successes against the Persians, the tide soon turned against him. Shapur launched a new invasion, capturing several cities and inflicting heavy defeats on the Romans. Valerian attempted to negotiate, but his efforts would lead to one of the most humiliating events in Roman imperial history. By 259 to 260, Valerian faced the full might of the Persian offensive. His army, weakened by plague and shortages, was in no condition to match Shapur's forces. In a desperate move, Valerian personally led negotiations with the Persian king, perhaps seeking to secure the release of prisoners or arrange a temporary truce. Instead, he was treacherously seized by Shapur, becoming the first Roman emperor to be captured alive by a foreign enemy. The shock of this event reverberated throughout the empire. For Rome, the capture of Valerian was not just a personal tragedy, but a devastating blow to imperial prestige. Never before had the Roman people seen their emperor humiliated in such a way. The Persians used Valerian's capture for propaganda purposes. According to later sources, Shapur paraded the emperor as a trophy, forcing him to kneel and serve as a human mounting block when the Persian king mounted his horse. Some accounts claim Valerian eventually died in captivity, and his skin was stuffed with straw and displayed as a symbol of Persian victory. Whether these gruesome details are entirely accurate or exaggerated by later historians is uncertain, but they reflect the deep humiliation felt by Romans at the loss of their emperor. Valerian as fate stood in stark contrast to the Roman ideal of the emperor as the embodiment of strength and divine favor. His capture seemed to confirm that the gods had abandoned Rome. Back in the West, Gallienus continued to rule as sole emperor, but his father's fate haunted his reign. The empire fractured further, with the Gallic Empire breaking away in the west under Postumus and the Palmyrene kingdom rising in the east under Odaenathus. Valerian's failure to secure the east had long-term consequences, as the Roman frontier in Mesopotamia remained vulnerable for decades. His persecution of Christians, far from unifying the empire, only created new martyrs and strengthened the resolve of the Christian communities, which continued to grow despite imperial opposition. In the end, Valerian's reign, which began with high hopes of restoring order through cooperation with his son and military vigor, ended in one of the greatest disgraces in Roman imperial history. Even so, Valerian should not be judged solely by his tragic end. He was a man of genuine ability, respected by his peers, and deeply committed to the survival of the empire. His decision to elevate Gallienus and share power anticipated later practices of joint rule, which would become a cornerstone of the tetrarchy established by Diocletian decades later. His campaigns in the East, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated his willingness to confront the empire's greatest threats directly. The fact that he personally led armies into battle, despite his advanced age, is a testament to his dedication. Yet history often remembers rulers not for their intentions, but for their outcomes, and in Valerian's case, the outcome was disaster. The capture of Valerian in 260 marked a low point in the 3rd century crisis. It symbolized the vulnerability of the Roman state, the limits of imperial authority, and the fragility of Rome's once invincible military power. His reign highlighted the challenges of governing an empire beset by multiple enemies, internal divisions, and economic collapse. While later emperors would work to restore order, Valerian's fate remained a cautionary tale of how even the mightiest empire could be humbled by misfortune, disease, and betrayal. The capture of Valerian by Shapur I in 260 was one of the most shocking events in the long history of Rome. And to fully understand its consequences, it is important to explore not only the circumstances that led to his downfall, but also the profound impact it had on the empire as a whole. The story of Valerian's later years, his humiliating captivity, and the ripple effects across the Roman world demonstrate how fragile imperial authority had become, and how the crisis of the 3rd century reached a new level of severity under his reign. When Valerian marched east to confront the Persians, he did so with determination, but also under extremely difficult conditions. His army had been ravaged by the plague, supplies were scarce, and morale was shaken. Shapur I, unlike the foes Rome had traditionally faced on the eastern frontier, commanded a highly organized and confident state. The Sassanian Empire was not a loose coalition of tribes, but a centralized monarchy with ambitions equal to Rome. Shapur had already inflicted defeats on previous emperors, and his victories had bolstered Persian prestige throughout the East. When Valerian led his army to confront Shapur in Mesopotamia, he was walking into a battlefield where Rome's resources and resilience were being tested at their limits. The disaster unfolded gradually. Valerian's forces suffered heavily in a series of skirmishes, and when he attempted to negotiate with Shapur, he likely hoped to buy time, reorganize his forces, or secure a temporary truce. Instead, he found himself betrayed. The details of his capture are disputed by ancient sources, but what is clear is that Valerian, the emperor of Rome, the commander of legions, and the supreme authority of the empire, was taken alive by the Persians. The humiliation of this moment cannot be overstated. Roman emperors had been killed in battle before, assassinated by their guards, or overthrown by usurpers, but never had one been seized and paraded as a living trophy by a foreign enemy. Shapur, I did not waste the opportunity. According to his own inscriptions, such as the famous Res Gesta Divi Seporis, carved on the Kaba Zartosht in Nakshi Rustam, the Persian king boasted of his victory over Valerian and the capture of tens of thousands of Roman soldiers. He portrayed himself as a chosen ruler favored by the gods, destined to humble Rome and extend Persia's power. For the Persians, Valerian's capture was both a propaganda triumph and a practical advantage. The Roman prisoners were reportedly put to work on major construction projects, including the great dam and city works at Gondeshapur. Roman engineering skills were valuable, and Shapur made use of them to enhance the infrastructure of his empire. For Valerian personally, the situation was dire. Ancient accounts differ on his treatment. Some claim that Shapur used him as a footstool when mounting his horse, forcing the once proud emperor to kneel in humiliation before the Persian monarch. Others suggest that Valerian was treated with some degree of respect as a valuable captive, but whatever his conditions, he never regained his freedom. Later sources describe his death in captivity in gruesome terms, claiming that he was flayed alive and that his skin was stuffed with straw and displayed in a Persian temple as a permanent reminder of Rome's defeat. While these lurid details may have been embellished by hostile Roman or Christian writers eager to highlight the emperor's tragic fate, what matters is that Valerian never returned, and his captivity remained a permanent stain on Roman honor. Back in the Roman world, the news of Valerian's capture spread panic. The emperor's absence created a power vacuum in the east, and local governors and generals were left scrambling to contain the Persian advance. Antioch, one of the empire's most important cities, had already fallen to Shapur, and Roman authority in Syria and Mesopotamia seemed on the verge of collapse. Into this chaos stepped Odaenathus, the ruler of Palmyra, a wealthy caravan city that had long balanced between Rome and Persia. Odaenathus rallied his forces, struck back against Shapur, and eventually restored some stability to the region. His emergence as a regional power demonstrated how Rome was increasingly dependent on local strongmen to hold the empire together when central authority faltered. Meanwhile, in the west, Gallienus was left as sole emperor. The transition was not smooth. Gallienus had already been struggling with invasions by the Alemanni, Franks, and Goths, as well as rebellions by usurpers across the provinces. The capture of his father undermined the legitimacy of the imperial office itself, making it easier for ambitious generals to declare themselves emperor in defiance of Gallienus. The empire began to fracture in earnest. In Gaul, Postumus, a capable general, declared independence and established what came to be known as the Gallic Empire, controlling Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain. In the east, the Palmyrene kingdom under Odaenathus acted almost independently, though nominally loyal to Rome. What had once been a unified empire was now splitting into separate spheres of power, each led by local rulers or generals. Valerian's absence also had a profound effect on Rome's population and the Senate. For centuries, Romans had believed that their empire was protected by divine favor and the strength of their emperors. To see one of those emperors captured alive, humiliated, and paraded by a foreign king shook that belief to its core. Some contemporaries interpreted Valerian's fate as divine punishment for his persecution of Christians. Christian writers, such as Lactantius, saw it as proof that God had avenged the martyrs killed during Valerian's reign. To them, the once mighty emperor's downfall was a direct consequence of his hostility to the followers of Christ. Pagan Romans, on the other hand, may have viewed it as a sign of Rome's decline and the anger of the traditional gods at the empire's disunity and corruption. Either way, Valerian's capture was a moral and psychological blow as much as a political one. The effects of his captivity continued for years. Gallienus, though talented in some respects, could not hold the empire together against the combined weight of invasions, plagues, and breakaway regimes. The Gothic invasions continued to ravage the Balkans and Asia Minor, while the Alemanni repeatedly threatened Italy. The Danubian frontier was constantly breached, and Germanic tribes settled deeper into Roman territory. The once secure Rhine and Danube defenses were crumbling. Without Valerian, and with Gallienus stretched thin, the empire entered one of its darkest periods. From the perspective of the Persians, Valerian's capture was a triumph, but it also had limits. Shapur I had achieved glory and propaganda success, but he could not permanently conquer the Roman East. His victories, though spectacular, were contained in part by local resistance from figures like Odaenathus, who eventually defeated Persian forces and restored Roman control over much of Syria. In this sense, Valerian's loss did not mean the total collapse of Roman power in the East, but it underscored how dependent Rome had become on the loyalty and initiative of local allies. The empire was no longer the invincible juggernaut it had been under Trajan or Hadrian. For Valerian himself, his years in captivity must have been filled with despair. To go from the highest office of the Roman world, worshipped as Augustus, commander of armies, master of provinces, to a prisoner in the hands of a foreign king, was the ultimate reversal of fortune. No Roman could have imagined such a fate. Even emperors who had been assassinated or overthrown had at least died with some dignity. Valerian, by contrast, was reduced to a symbol of Roman weakness. His personal suffering, though largely hidden in the shadows of Persian records, left an indelible mark on the Roman imagination. Later, emperors were determined never to repeat his mistake, and his fate was held up as a warning of what could happen if a non-emperor exposed himself too recklessly to danger or trusted too much in the mercy of an enemy. The broader historical significance of Valerian's capture lies in what it revealed about the nature of the 3rd century crisis. The empire was too vast, too vulnerable, and too dependent on the abilities of individual rulers to withstand the combined forces of plague, invasion, and internal revolt. Valerian had tried to address this problem by sharing power with Gallienus, but his personal downfall only emphasized how fragile even the dual emperor system was. Later, under Diocletian, the empire would formalize a system of multiple emperors in the Tetrarchy to prevent such disasters. But in Valerian's time, the idea of sharing power was still experimental, and the consequences of failure were catastrophic. Valerian's persecution of Christians also became more significant in light of his capture. To Christians, his downfall was divine justice, and his fate was recounted for generations as proof of the triumph of their God over Rome's persecutors. In Christian memory, Valerian was not remembered as a capable senator or a man of noble background, but as a tyrant who suffered divine retribution. This interpretation shaped how his reign was viewed long after his death, influencing Christian historians who preserved much of the narrative of the 3rd century. In this way, Valerian's policies not only failed to achieve religious unity, but also cemented his negative reputation among one of the empire's most enduring communities. By the end of his reign, if it can even be called that after his capture, the Roman Empire had reached one of its lowest points. The emperor was a prisoner in Persia. The western provinces were breaking away. The Danube frontier was collapsing, and plague and economic decline sapped the vitality of Roman society. The crisis of the 3rd century was at its height, and Valerian's failure became a symbol of the empire's vulnerability. Yet, paradoxically, his reign also showed Rome's resilience, for despite the humiliation, despite the fractures, the empire did not collapse entirely. Gallienus continued to fight. Local rulers like Odaenathus defended their regions, and within a few decades, emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian would restore stability. Valerian, however, never saw this recovery. His story ended in captivity, far from Rome, a reminder of how even the mightiest emperor could be brought low by the unpredictability of fate and the shifting balance of power between Rome and its rivals. His personal tragedy reflected the larger tragedy of the empire in the 3rd century, a world of constant war, disease, and fragmentation, where emperors were as likely to be killed by their own troops as to die in bed, and where even the sacred aura of the imperial office could not protect them from disaster. The story of Valerian does not end with his capture by Shapur I, because the consequences of that event rippled across the empire for years, shaping both the immediate course of Roman politics and the long-term memory of imperial rule. His captivity marked a rupture, not only in the military and political fortunes of Rome, but also in the symbolic authority of the emperor himself. To understand the full weight of Valerian's reign, one must look beyond his lifetime into the years that followed, when his son Gallienus struggled to carry the empire forward, when local rulers stepped into the vacuum of authority, and when Valerian's legacy became a matter of interpretation for pagans, Christians, and later historians alike. Gallienus suddenly found himself as the sole ruler of a shattered empire. When news reached him of his father's capture, the challenge before him was immense. He had to preserve the empire's unity, restore Roman prestige, and prevent the morale of the legions from collapsing completely. Yet his reign was marked by the very forces that had plagued Valerian: constant invasions, usurpations, economic breakdown, and religious tensions. What Valerian had tried to solve by dividing power between father and son now rested entirely on Gallienus' shoulders. To some extent, Gallienus rose to the occasion. He proved an energetic and capable general, defeating the Alemanni near Milan, checking Gothic raids, and reorganizing the cavalry into a powerful mobile reserve. Yet his achievements were overshadowed by the continuing disintegration of the empire. The western provinces, particularly Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain, broke away under the leadership of Postumus, who declared himself emperor and founded the Gallic Empire. This secession was not a minor revolt, but a rival state with its own emperors, administration, and military power lasting until the reign of Aurelian. In the east, Palmyra under Odaenathus acted with increasing autonomy, defending Syria against the Persians, but asserting its own authority rather than Rome's. These developments revealed the consequences of Valerian's capture. Once the aura of imperial invincibility was shattered, provincial leaders saw little reason to remain loyal to a distant emperor when they could secure their own regions more effectively. For the Roman Senate and elite, Valerian's fate was especially disturbing. He had been one of their own, a senator of noble background, a man steeped in the traditions of Rome. Unlike many emperors of the 3rd century, who had risen from the military ranks with little regard for aristocratic values, Valerian represented a link to the old order. His humiliation at the hands of a foreign king was a symbolic humiliation for the Senate itself. If a man of their class could be so degraded, what hope was left for the dignity of Rome's ruling institutions? This shock contributed to the declining influence of the Senate in imperial affairs. While Gallienus continued to consult with senators and honor some traditions, the real power was shifting irreversibly toward the military and provincial strongmen. The Christian community, on the other hand, saw Valerian's downfall through a very different lens. During his reign, he had initiated one of the harshest persecutions of Christians in Roman history, issuing edicts that targeted bishops, clergy, and prominent believers, leading to executions, confiscations, and exile. Among those martyred were Pope Sixtus II and the deacon Lawrence, whose stories inspired generations of Christians. When Valerian was captured and humiliated, Christian writers interpreted it as divine retribution. Lactantius, in particular, emphasized that Valerian had suffered the punishment of God for his cruelty to the Church, describing his captivity and death in lurid detail to underscore the justice of the Christian God over pagan emperors. This narrative was powerful, not only in shaping how Christians remembered Valerian, but also in reinforcing their conviction that their faith would ultimately triumph over the empire that sought to destroy them. From the perspective of later historians, Valerian's reign became a pivotal episode in the crisis of the 3rd century. He embodied both the old senatorial tradition and the desperation of Rome to hold its frontiers against overwhelming odds. His decision to share power with Gallienus anticipated later reforms under Diocletian, but his failure to coordinate effectively with his son exposed the weaknesses of a divided empire. His capture by Shapur was remembered as a singular humiliation, a moment when Rome's aura of invincibility cracked. The fact that his body was never returned to Rome, and that he died in captivity, reinforced the sense of incompleteness and dishonor that surrounded his reign. Unlike emperors who died in battle and were mourned by their troops, Valerian was absent, a void in the imperial narrative. Yet in some ways, Valerian's tragedy also forced Rome to adapt. Gallienus introduced reforms that laid the groundwork for later recovery, such as elevating equestrian officers over senators in military commands, a move that professionalized the army but further sidelined the aristocracy. These changes reflected the reality that senatorial emperors like Valerian, despite their pedigree, were not necessarily capable of saving the empire in its time of need. The crisis demanded military efficiency and pragmatic leadership, not noble lineage. Thus, Valerian's failure indirectly accelerated the transformation of the Roman state into a more militarized and autocratic system. In the provinces, Valerian's fate was remembered differently depending on local contexts. In the east, where Shapur displayed his victory inscriptions, Valerian was a symbol of Persia's triumph and Rome's weakness. The Persians took pride in having captured the Roman emperor, something no other enemy had accomplished. In Palmyra, however, Valerian's absence created the conditions for Odaenathus and later, Queen Zenobia to rise as defenders of the East, ultimately carving out a semi-independent Palmyrene empire that rivaled Rome itself for control of the eastern provinces. In the West, the memory of Valerian mattered less than the immediate need for protection from barbarian raids, and local loyalty shifted to generals like Postumus, who provided security when the distant emperors could not. The symbolism of Valerian's capture lingered long after his death. Later emperors were haunted by the fear of repeating his fate. When Galerius campaigned against the Persians in the early 4th century, he took care to avoid exposing himself recklessly, mindful of Valerian's humiliation. When Diocletian established the Tetrarchy, dividing the empire among 4 rulers, the memory of Valerian's failure to maintain stability with 2 emperors likely influenced his more systematic approach. Even Constantine, in his later wars with Persia, would have been aware of the precedent set by Valerian's disastrous end. In this way, Valerian's captivity cast a long shadow over imperial strategy and ideology. The way Valerian was remembered also reveals much about the shifting values of the late Roman world. To pagans, his fate was a tragedy, a cruel twist of fortune that demonstrated the fragility of human power. To Christians, it was divine justice, proof that emperors could not escape the judgment of the true God. To military men, it was a lesson in caution, a warning not to trust too much in negotiations with an enemy, or to expose oneself without adequate protection. To later reformers, it was evidence of the need for structural change in the empire. In every case, Valerian's story became more than the biography of a single man. It became a moral, political, and cultural symbol of the 3rd century crisis. Valerian's legacy, therefore, is complex. On the one hand, he was a capable senator and administrator, a man respected by his peers, who tried to save the empire by sharing power with his son and confronting its most dangerous enemy directly. On the other hand, his reign ended in disaster, his policies failed to stabilize the empire, and his persecution of Christians ensured his memory would be blackened in one of the most enduring traditions of late antiquity. He was both a man of his time and a victim of forces beyond his control: plague, invasion, and the structural weaknesses of the empire. Even in captivity, Valerian remained emperor in name. Coins were minted bearing his image, and official documents continued to acknowledge him. Yet everyone knew that the man himself was far away, humiliated in Persia, and that Gallienus ruled alone. The duality of Valerian's status still emperor yet powerless underscored the contradictions of the 3rd century, when legitimacy was fragile and authority was often more symbolic than real. His absence was as telling as his presence had once been, a reminder that the empire could not rely on individuals alone, but needed deeper reforms to survive. Ultimately, Valerian's reign and its ignominious end serve as a microcosm of the 3rd century crisis itself. The empire was beset by external enemies, weakened by internal divisions, plagued by disease, and undermined by economic collapse. Valerian attempted to hold it together through traditional values, senatorial cooperation, military campaigns, and religious uniformity, but all of these efforts failed. His capture by Shapur was not just a personal misfortune, but a symbol of the empire as vulnerability, an image of Rome brought low by forces it could not control. Yet the empire endured, battered but not destroyed, and in time it would recover under stronger, more pragmatic rulers. Valerian himself, however, never returned. His bones, if they were preserved at all, lay in Persian soil, far from the city of Rome, whose glory he had once sought to defend. His memory lived on in stories of humiliation and divine punishment, in inscriptions boasting of Persian triumph, in Christian accounts of martyrs avenged, and in the reforms of later emperors determined never to suffer his fate. He remains one of the most tragic figures of Roman history, not because he was a tyrant or a villain, but because he embodied the hopes of Rome at a moment of crisis and ended his days as the prisoner of a rival king. His story is a reminder that even the greatest empires can falter, and even the mightiest rulers can be brought low by the currents of history.